Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to talk about this very old yet super effective way of correcting your ink drawings, either because you drew an incorrect line or because your pen dripped all over the paper. This is called an ink scraper, and I'll show you how it works and why, even though it's probably been about 50 years since one has been made, you should get one for yourself. We'll also touch on other correcting options such as ink erasers and discuss why you might want to choose one over the other. Let's get started. But before I do, I'd like to briefly tell you about my YouTube membership program. For a small monthly fee, channel members get access to a library of full-length tutorials with 2 new videos every single month. It's a great way to support my channel and get access to detailed long-form instruction. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Here is an ink scraper which I purchased from eBay some time ago for about $15. It's in perfect condition, and there are tons more like it on eBay for around that price, more if you want something fancier, let's say with a mother of pearl handle. The reason why they're so easily available is 1, they used to be a very common piece of stationery, and 2, nowadays most people have no use for them, and they sit next to other items inherited from the grandparents and are often mistaken for letter openers. Ink scrapers work in a very simple way by simply scraping away dry ink and paper fibers until the mistake is gone. So, for best result, you want to hold the blade at about a 45-degree angle. This way you're not cutting into the paper, but scraping. If you see peach fuzz, aka paper fibers, coming off the paper, that means you're doing it correctly. What you shouldn't see are big chunks of paper coming off, because that means that you're cutting into the paper and not actually scraping. I also recommend rotating the paper so that you're not constantly scraping at the same angle, which is going to give you slightly more even results. And I believe that the flatter side of the blade is used for burnishing the paper surface to smooth it out, remove excess paper fibers, so that you can go over the line again with your correction. How well they work depends on the paper and, of course, the ink. Papers that are sized, such as watercolor papers, tend to work better since the sizing prevents the ink from penetrating the paper, and because those papers tend to be thicker, reducing the risk that you'll scrape a hole into them. And of course, smoother papers will work better than rougher papers, since it's difficult to scrape away an uneven surface. Bristol papers tend to not work as well since the paper fibers are very compressed, making them harder to scrape off, and because such papers tend to be quite absorbent. As for inks, waterproof drawing inks are more easily removed since they're thicker and tend to sit on the surface of the paper. The removability of fountain pen inks will vary since some inks penetrate the paper fibers more readily than others. In short, performance will vary, so be sure to test out how well your paper and ink combination will erase before starting a project. Let's see how the ink scraper works on a variety of different inks, all on one of my favorite papers for drawing with ink, Stonehenge Legion paper. Let's start off with India ink. Now let's try scraping away Noodler's Bulletproof Black. Fountain pen ink tends to penetrate a little bit more into the paper fibers, so potentially it might be slightly more difficult to scrape away. and it comes off fairly well. Let's move down to Noodler's Lexington Gray, which is one of my favorite inks for drawing with a fountain pen. And this ink tends to be a little bit more fluid than Noodler's Black. It tends to penetrate a little more deeply and even sometimes strikes through certain drawing papers. And that came off fairly easy. And now let's try removing Micron Pigma ink. So that comes from one of these felt tip liners. Let's see how that works. And lastly, let's try our hand at this water-soluble fountain pen ink. And I'm trying to scrape and not to cut. Now, you may ask, why don't you just use white correcting fluid? Is it not a much more effective way of covering up mistakes with the added benefit that you can add white details to your ink drawings? If you're working on pure white paper like this, you absolutely can. But that pretty snow white paper is a recent invention, and the majority of old masters worked on paper that was either light gray, like this, or had a tone to it, like this. I suppose in this case you could mix up a quick drying paint to match the paper color if you make a mistake, but for such papers I think an ink scraper is probably the better option. You may also ask, can't I just use an ink eraser, which is an eraser with an abrasive component, sometimes called a sand eraser? While they do work, it really depends on the paper. On softer papers, they seem to work about as well as the ink scraper, but on harder papers like this, they struggle somewhat, and it takes quite a bit of rubbing to see any effect at all. And though it will eventually make the ink disappear, the process takes minutes to do something that with an ink scraper can be done in a few seconds. So let's try it with the Noodler's Black. This again is an ink that penetrates the paper a little bit more thoroughly. It does work, but again with ink scraper it can be done with more control and much faster. Here's Noodler's Lexington Gray. Not quite as effective. And again, with ink scraper, you can go in and with a lot more control, even if you're careful enough, scrape out an individual line. Something that's difficult to do with an ink eraser. Now, to be fair, there are some ink erasers in eraser holders like this. This is the Hyper Eraser made by Pentel, which allows you to work into details. But I found this eraser is actually softer than this one, and well, look, this one has a sharp edge, so I might be able to go into detail and erase a single hatch mark, but again, not nearly as effectively as one of these ink scrapers. Now, here's another question. Can you do the same thing with some kind of utility knife or another sharp blade? Yes, but I found that you have significantly less control. So for example, sometimes you see artists doing the same thing with an X-Acto knife blade. So you can use an X-Acto knife, and if you hold it sideways, you might be able to scrape out some lines. But there's a greater chance that you're going to eat through the paper or start tearing the paper than with an ink scraper. I think the closest thing to it is a rounded blade from a Swiss Army knife like this. It works in somewhat similar ways, with the rounded blade preventing the scraping process from eating into the paper too deeply. The unique rounded shape of the ink scraper gives you the best control over the scraping process and has no substitute. We really should trust the wisdom of the ancients here, for whom working in pen and ink was part of everyday life, who inherited refined working methods passed down to them over many generations. And though this chain of knowledge has been broken to some extent, I believe it can still be recovered through the many instructional texts left behind and through tools, many of which, like this ink scraper, are still very much around. And even though they're no longer being made, there's still enough of them for anyone interested in practicing and reviving lost ways of correcting mistakes. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on the ink scraper and that it inspired you to give this tool a try. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider becoming a channel member, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.